So, hello, my name is Jason Ellis, and I'm an English professor at the New York City College of Technology, part of the CUNY system, and it's also called City Tech. My guest in this interview for a special issue of NANO, New American Notes Online, is Emily Hockaday, who is the managing editor and poetry editor for Asimov Science Fiction and Analog Science Fiction and Fact. It's been a great honor to me to get to know Emily over the past 6, 7 years through collaborations on the annual City Tech Science Fiction Symposium, which includes an analog writers panel and the announcement of the winner of the Analog Award for Emerging Black Voices. Emily agreed to talk with me today about generative artificial intelligence, which we've discussed before about what effects it's having on culture in general and the science fiction publishing industry specifically. She added and expanded on her thoughts in a thought provoking guest editorial in the May June 2023 issue of Analog Science Fiction and Fact. And so I thought, why don't we begin there, Emily? And can you tell us a little bit about the editorial on generative AI and SF publishing?
Well, I wrote this very early on in the advent of AI reaching the masses. So I think I was writing it like a full year ago. It
Mm.
was, yeah, October. I think we had our conversation in September, and
Ah,
then that started the seeds of this editorial. Thank you for that, by the way, Jason. And I was writing it, yeah, in October and November. So it was early on, but we had already run through Crayon or Dali Mini like in the spring. I remember lots of friends going on there and just like laughing at the ridiculous images that came up with ridiculous prompts. And it was just before I think OpenAI, before ChatGPT had been released. But there was another algorithm, like a text generating algorithm that had come out, and that had inspired me to, yeah, to get this editorial out because it seemed like it was just waiting to explode, and then of course it did.
mm-hmm. And I guess, thinking about like where we're at now, where there are real threats to people's jobs, it seems like all this started with like, kind of like toys, that it was something silly and playful, and it's kind of turned into something much, I don't know, scarier or more advanced than that now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think because living in a capitalist society, it's just like corporations, can see a way to use this to raise profits, and they're going to try to. Unfortunately, that's just, I think, how our society functions. I'm still like clinging on desperately to optimism that like this will fail. um, I probably am wrong, but I'm still trying to stay hopeful that like it won't be as easy to replace people as I think a lot of companies are imagining it will be.
Right. And I guess you tied in with these issues of what effect generative AI is going to have on society and creative work. It seems like there's like these tensions that you explore in your editorial. And maybe one of the biggest that applies to SF is the rights of authors and artists versus the fair use of using their works to train AI technologies. Um, I'm wondering if like you have some thoughts about like, is there a way to resolve that, or do we need to have a total rethink on what the rights of the individual and the rights of the commons of all of us in terms of how we use the works that get published in analog or in books, etc.
Mhm. Well, I mean, for me, personally, my personal ethics,
Hmm.
I think it's wrong to
Hmm.
use, people's writing to train the AI. And of course, just in the past week, I've been seeing so many authors that I follow, so many authors in the industry,
Hmm.
even other poets I've seen where their work was included in this like big grab that OpenAI did from a website where they could torrent books.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know what's going to happen with that. It seems like there are a lot of people making complaints, and maybe there'll be a class action lawsuit. I don't know. Is it Microsoft, I think, who's on the hook now?
I'm not sure exactly how some of those lawsuits are playing out, but certainly they've been making investments in OpenAI to incorporate it into Bing search, and which I think in some ways is making AI much more accessible to a lot of people who, you know, on the one hand, some are using it for playful purposes, but then there are other people that are using it for, either business or even to in a sense ape the work of creative artists, to
Mhm.
make stories that are similar in style, or poems that mirror the work of someone else, right? And it does so with very few barriers. It's like you get a Microsoft account, you log in, and then you can start working with it.
Mhm.
So I guess maybe there's that added aspect of like how easy it is now to access these technologies, for someone who just wants to find out what they're about versus someone who may be using them, um, if not for what are termed illegal yet, but what we might think are unethical reasons, right? To make money, in a sense, or gain some notoriety or prestige from producing something that looks like the work of Heinlein or the work of Asimov or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and so I guess in one other aspect of that, another tension that exists is that there's competition now that, regardless of the legality of these things, now they're in the marketplace are people that are producing AI generated stuff, whether it's explicit or not. And then the artists, the human artists that are toiling away trying to continue producing art that is essentially competing not only amongst themselves but also with the generative AI stuff. And I guess that, from your perspective, not just as an editor but as a poet, um, how does that make you feel? What does that make you think about?
Well, I will say that certainly the text generating has gotten better. Maybe like 6 months ago, the text generator couldn't even do free verse poetry. Like,
Mm,
as far as I saw the chat GPT-3, it was like you ask it for a poem and it would give you something in rhyming couplets or ABAB
mm,
scheme or tercets, but always rhyme, always metered,
mm,
which is not, I mean, plenty of modern poets write that way, but not predominantly,
mm,
you know.
mm,
So I was like feeling a little glib, I would say at the time. I was like, oh, these algorithm based generators can't even make like a modern free verse poem. Well, now they can. That's been changed. I mean, that's gotten more sophisticated, but the poems are still bad.
mm,
Like I saw a friend who like asked an AI generator like write a like if it was me, I'm not going to name her, but if it was me, I would have been write an Emily Hockaday poem. So
mm,
she put her name in and asked it to write a poem in the style of her, and she posted it to get a
mm,
laugh.
mm,
And it had taken the first line of one of her poems to start, and then the poem was just like really trash.
mm,
It was very bad. It was didn't make much sense, and then it was overly narrative in places. And again, like I said, in 6 months, like it became much more sophisticated. So I don't want to say that a text generator will never be able to write a poem as well as a human, because
mm,
maybe it will.
mm,
But right now, I still feel that we're at a place where it's extremely easy to tell the difference.
mm. And I guess there's something about the way generative AI is like stringing words together in, probabilistic fashion of like what does it think should come next based on a certain context and
Right.
instruction. Um, but there's something, at least for the present, that we as human beings can look at and point to and say, this is obviously bad or not written by a human versus something that we would readily identify as being human generated. It's it's something indelible, hard to articulate, but at least for the time being, it seems like that is the kind of a hallmark of what we're able to do in distinguishing the artificial versus the quote unquote real human
Mhm.
generated stuff. Now, one thing to maybe problematize this a little bit is another tension that was in your editorial about traditional compositional work. You're thinking about which historically is used and continues to use a variety of technologies. I mean, we have autocorrect, we have spell check, those types of things built into our word processors, for example, versus the potential for new fiction and poetry and art um, in which artists leverage generative AI. And I'll throw this out there as a really great example. Natrice R. Gaskins is a generative AI artist, and she does some really neat stuff using it as a part of her toolbox to make new things. An example of this that I haven't yet read about, but I imagine will happen at some point, um, if you're thinking about um, Meta's Llama, their large language model, which is they call open source, but isn't really open source, but it's the closest thing we've got to that right now. Well, what someone can do is create basically an add-on to their large language model. So you have like the large language model, and then you can create a thing called a LoRa on a smaller data set, but it would be a tailored data set. So, like, let's say Emily Hockaday, she could build a LoRa based on all of her poems. And so when she goes to use Llama, she layers the LoRa on top of it and says, I would like a poem in the style of Emily Hockaday. And it would produce something that probably would be a lot closer aligned with your work than just using, like, say OpenAI's stuff that may only know one or two examples of your work that it pulled from the internet somewhere. So what are your thoughts about artists using AI as a part of their wheelhouse, or is that maybe taking things a step too far?
That's a tricky question for sure. That's like where it becomes very gray, I would
Mhm.
say for me. I don't remember if I touched on this in my editorial, but when I was researching for the editorial, I was reading about writers who self-publish and make a living self-publishing and who are on really tight deadlines because in the self-publishing game, I guess when you have a series going and you have fans that are like obsessed with your series,
Mhm. Mhm.
if you miss deadlines, you really risk, like highly risk losing some of those fans. I guess there's like metrics on it, and it's
Mhm.
like fans will wait X number of months before they go to find a different series to follow, and you might lose fans. And so this one writer who I was reading an article about, she was using a text generating algorithm that she had trained with all of her own work, all of her own novels. She had fed the novel that she was writing into it, and she used it, giving it prompts to like write filler scenes
Mhm.
in between what she had written as connective tissue. And then she edited them, and made them her own.
Mhm.
But she was like really feeling the deadline, and she was like, this is going to help me so much. I feel like there's a difference between doing something like that and just basically plagiarizing a bunch of anonymous to
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
individuals, who have poured their blood, sweat, and tears into their writing,
Mhm.
and then using an algorithm that's been fed off of this plagiarized data and trying to sell that as your own.
Mhm.
I do
Mhm.
think there's a distinct difference.
Right.
I still feel very iffy about these text generative AIs, like ethically in general. I feel weird about them. They consume they consume a lot of water,
Mhm.
potable drinking water, just like mining for Bitcoin does. So they're
Mhm.
very bad environmentally, and
Mhm.
they open up doors to all these terrible places. In my opinion. But like you're saying, there is a difference between an artist using their own work and using this algorithm as a tool to produce more of their own personal work than just like grabbing from the internet whoever's, source material.
Right. And I think that this ties back into the point that you raised earlier about capitalism. And that on the one hand, there's certainly, I'm sure that kind of research into like how to retain like fans, like if you're self-publishing, but there is a certain aspect of being able to produce and produce quickly enough to meet the demand in order to retain those fans, in order to simply put food on the table, for some folks, right? um, and so there, in a certain sense, there's this other aspect of capitalism, I think, that's driving the use of generative AI, which is I think maybe even more insidious or more scary in terms of like using it in the workplace to write an email, or in this case, like being able to meet a deadline. Um, and I don't know if in some ways it sounds a little bit like people are being pushed to have to use the technology simply to keep up with the rat race, to keep up with capitalism's demands on the individual in different ways. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is danger there that everyone is going to suddenly feel that they need to be an expert algorithm trainer in order to keep their jobs. I'm very against an algorithm taking a person's job. It seems so unnecessary. I
Mhm.
mean, there just are enough profits. In
Right.
my opinion. I'm always here to rail against capitalism. It seems very unnecessary, but I hear it. I hear it just out in society. People are worried about this. People are thinking, like, how can I become an expert in this so that I can be marketable, so that I can
Mhm.
keep a job? And we are running an editorial and analog in a couple issues
Mhm.
where the argument is that AI is a tool that we will need to learn to stay put, like in creative fields.
Mhm.
I mean, I hope that doesn't become true, but it very well could.
Right. And I guess related to that is also an issue that you bring up in the editorial, about how certain authors or that may use like a tool like this take over a certain amount of market share. You're thinking like people are saying the same thing now about like Taylor Swift. Like she's so big in our culture that she's pulling dollars away from smaller indie artists that just don't get recognized or don't pick up fans because um, just I don't know. It's a phenomenon, that it's hard to imagine she's just an individual, but it's like this bigger thing. And so with like generative AI, you can imagine if we start seeing like new Asimov novels being published in his style or Heinlein novels, and some of these dead authors, as you go to the bookstore, are already taking up vast amounts of shelf space. So it seems like it's going to make a bad problem even worse. What do you think about that?
Yes, I did touch on that in the editorial, I think in a tongue-in-cheek way, saying what if we
Mhm,
can get all these new novels by feeding, training
mhm,
a specific, an
mhm,
Asimov algorithm,
uh,
or I, made the joke that we'd want more albums from young
mhm,
songstresses that died too soon. And
mhm, mhm,
there are certainly people on my list, that I love that from. But in all seriousness, I agree that it's taking shelf space from new writers. That's how culture is supposed to progress. We're
mhm,
not supposed to stay stagnated. We don't need more Asimov
mhm,
novels. He wrote novels, he built up a genre, he did a lot. But it's time for new people to
mhm,
step up, and it's time for the genre to change. And if we backpedal and start, reading like new works from classic authors, I just that's I guess that's why I titled my editorial "The Dystopia of Culture,"
Mm,
because I'm like, that's not the direction we want to go. We don't want to go with like a flat randomization of AI nonsense being turned out, and we also don't want to go backward to like highly trained, maybe technically good writing by dead people.
right. And I guess on the a last level related to your editorial is not just in the way that text is generated, the stories might be generated, but in the decision making process of the magazines or in the publishing industry. That it seems like AI could further flatten our culture. That instead of like opening it up to new vistas, new voices, new ways of doing things, that if we train AI to make decisions about what goes into the magazine or what gets published on the shelves, that it's only going to reproduce or select those things that reproduce what came in the past. Is that a concern?
Um, I did joke about that in the editorial as well. I right now I'm not concerned with that.
Mm,
I just feel like what we're seeing from these algorithms is really bland.
mm, mm,
And I can't imagine our readers, like, let's say
mm,
an algorithm started choosing the stories,
mm,
right, for Asimov's and analog. Our readers would unsubscribe immediately. Like, the stories are, we don't accept AI submissions. That's a
mm,
big part of the magazines. And in the submission process, you have to check that not an AI wasn't AI generated before submitting. Obviously, we're still getting plenty, but it's
mm,
easy, very easy to weed them out right now because they're so obvious and so bad. But there's nothing compelling.
mm,
I like I said, things do get more sophisticated and very quickly, but in the year that this has been going on, there is nothing good
mm,
still. It hasn't the fiction has not become, or the poetry submissions too. We see some of those, not as many, but some. There's nothing that would even at this point come close to passing as human written to like, at least to an editor.
right.
There's like no chance of us accidentally publishing something that was written with AI. So I guess that still has me feeling like safe
Mm-hmm.
for now that we need editors, that we need people, humans to, adjudicate and curate.
Right. And you mentioned that through the submission process now, there's the checkbox like this wasn't generated by AI. When did y'all roughly add that to the submission process? Has that been there for a while?
That was added to the Asimovs. Actually, it's in our guidelines for analog, but we don't
Mm-hmm.
have the checkbox yet just because we
Mm-hmm.
haven't upgraded. But Asimovs had that upgrade done in March
Mm-hmm.
2023.
And was that in response to beginning to see more submissions that were
Yeah.
AI generated?
Yeah. We were hoping that that would slightly cut down some of those submissions.
Right. Um, how many or numbers or percentages would you say you guys began to see in the two magazines that were AI generated?
Um, it has gone up and down, but I would say our submissions almost doubled.
Wow.
Yeah. Luckily, it's very easy to weed out so
Mm,
far. So it does still take time,
mm,
though, away from the editors, which is difficult. But it's easy, to tell the difference. But yeah, basically submissions doubled.
that's amazing. And I mean, that puts a lot more work and labor that y'all have to put in to,
Mhm.
because even if something's bad, you still have to find out that it's bad. That takes
Yeah.
time to read through.
You have to open the submission. And, I would say usually you can tell in the first couple of sentences that
Mm,
it's AI. So that isn't time wasted. But you have to physically open the file, close it, mark that you want to ban it. It takes time.
and how many folks are having to read these per month? I mean, there's you And
I don't read the slush, actually. I
uh,
only read the poetry. So for
okay,
analog, it's Trevor, and for Asimov's, it's Sheila.
wow.
You do it, yes. They read it all. I know, they're heroes.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it's like this collateral damage from people that are abusing the technology of generative AI to try to slip in something in the flagship magazines of the field. And do you think what are your thoughts or maybe things that you've heard about why people might do this? Like, are they just wanting to get like a publication credit, or because I don't think it's not the way to, it's not necessarily the path to riches, right? I mean, to publish a single story.
That I like ironically, that is what it is. We were listed on websites that are like publications that pay.
Wow.
So because we were on those websites, they started garnering interest and we're getting, yeah, submissions from all over the globe that have been, they go through it using the AI algorithms. And I think it really is like, oh, this is a way to make money, which I can't fault someone for trying, but
Mm,
it does make our job a lot harder when we're clogged up with submissions that we won't ever even consider, you know?
right. And it's nothing off there's nothing off their back because I mean it's open submission, so they just
Mhm.
submit and then you have to do the work.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was wondering, since some months have passed after your editorial, what has been some of the fan responses, the reader responses to your editorial?
So mostly people are writing in to agree with
Mm,
it, that this is something of concern.
mm,
Um, and some people had some kind of funny observations. There was a mistake in the magazine, and they were like, I read this editorial, and then I saw this block of repeated text. And of course, I responded, oops, that was just human error.
yeah.
Wish I could blame it on an algorithm, but no. Um, and then someone else wrote in with a very interesting point that when the text generators work, it doesn't matter if the text is accurate.
Mm,
It doesn't matter. That's not the point.
mm,
And it doesn't matter. Yeah, it just doesn't matter if it's truthful or accurate. And the point is really just to like write a thing
mm, mm,
and get text out there. And that's very dangerous. And I thought that was a really interesting point. He was comparing it to like propaganda because we
mm,
had had another article run in the magazine, a history piece, a special feature as we
mm,
call it, by Ed Wysocki Jr.
mm,
And it was about basically text that had been, written by people, but was like not, it was sort of trying to sway,
mm, mm,
sway the reader. And not going with the full truth. And so this person had seen the parallel there, that they were almost about the same thing, that like getting inundated with text, people will feel overwhelmed by it
mm,
and read it and might start to just think it's true.
mm,
And or just not care if it's true. And I think we are seeing that in terms of like meme sharing,
mm, mm,
on social media. Like people post memes that agree with them whether they're true or not. And I think that the problem that problem will amplify with AI generated text. Because when I wrote the editorial, I did look, I gave some prompts and I gave the examples, I published them in the piece. It was like a history of science fiction, and there were some
mm,
very ridiculous things like grandfather paradoxes, like Ray Bradbury was influenced by a novel called Fahrenheit 451, like that kind of thing. And then all sorts of other stuff that like people who know science fiction would laugh about because
mm,
obviously this isn't true. But if you didn't know science fiction and you didn't have like this understanding of how the text was generated, you
mm,
might just be like, oh, this isn't great writing, but maybe these facts are true,
mm.
and that there's this potential for misinformation just spreading wildly. And that is how the generators work. They don't care. There's no fact checking with them.
Right. And I guess that's kind of a scary thing for the future thing, especially thinking about like the upcoming presidential election, and thinking about like the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, like how granular the research is on how to push people's buttons, not necessarily to change their opinions 180 degrees, but how you can incrementally make adjustments. And with the work that was done before from Russia and other actors, will require people working at scale, which requires a lot of capital and a lot of like facilities, this kind of thing. But with generative AI, if you got someone smart enough to figure out the programming to do that kind of work at scale all within the AI, then you don't need all those people. So, not to say that I want those people to have jobs because the work they were doing was kind of evil and nasty, but
Mhm.
it's even more evil and nasty to think how much worse it can be when a generative AI is doing those little nudges, those little misinformation changes in people's thinking, what knowledge they have, how they make choices. That's kind of scary.
Yes, it can be much wider scale. It is scary.
Um, let's see. You mentioned like the changes to the submission box on Asimov's, and it's in the policies on analog. Um, the submissions have gone really up, and just scanning here, just I mean, we've covered a lot of things that we were going to talk about. Um, oh, one of the last things that I wanted to ask you about, we've been talking about text generation. What about with image generation? Has there been submissions or concerns about the artwork on the cover or the illustrations inside the magazine?
So the illustrations inside the magazine, we commission those
Hmm.
to artists that we've worked with for years and that we trust. So those are totally solid. And as soon as all this happened, we were very clear. Like we talked to our art department, we all met together, and we were like, we need to make sure that any cover image we use isn't using like AI generated art.
Hmm.
So we did like very early on, like make sure that that was a priority because we do use some stock art for
Hmm.
our covers. So there was a concern that like AI art is going to start filtering in there, you know. So we're on top of that.
Hmm.
We definitely don't want to showcase any AI generated art. We have such talented artists and we love working with them, you
Hmm.
know, and we want them to get to share their talent, you know.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that is heartening to me about analog and Asimov's. And yeah, I think it's true for some of the other science fiction magazines. You think of Clark's World, which has been at the center of this in online debate about the effects of generative AI on the back end of publishing.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like all of you are working toward supporting human agency, supporting human beings to have livelihoods, to be able to create good art, whether it be in writing or visually, for fans who are you totally engaged in what it is that we do in science fiction. And I think there's something really positive about that. So I guess in closing, do you have any final thoughts about generative AI, um, writing, images, its effect on the magazine?
I think we covered most of it. Yeah, just that we're gonna try and keep it all people made as long as we can, you know. I think part of the reason why we feel so passionately about it and why Neil from Clark's World feels so passionately about it is because we love our jobs. You know, we love what we do. I don't want someone to replace me with an algorithm. I don't want someone to replace our incredible authors with algorithms. You know, and I also think that our readers are really discerning. They would notice, you know, they expect a certain level of quality. I mean, you've seen our brass tacks
Mm-hmm.
column. They
That's
write
true.
in, you know, they would tell us right away. So I think that that's part of it. Like we feel really dedicated to the industry, and so do all of the other, science fiction magazines out there publishing. And I think that I hope that that will keep things, as they are and moving forward
Mhm.
with new writers, but as they are for the foreseeable future.
Well, I hope that you guys can you keep making science fiction a people first field. I think that with you all at the helm, it's definitely a strong possibility. I think it'll happen. And I assume we're going to continue having these discussions about the effects of AI. And I'm really curious what this is going to look like another year from now. Uh, so, I mean, thinking ahead, maybe pencil it in if you want. Maybe we should have another conversation a year
Yeah,
from now.
a yearly check in on the status.
We might get to a point where your AI will have an interview with my AI, but not.
For
Hopefully, we're not there
the
yet. For an AI audience, exactly.
audience.
So, Emily, thanks so much for taking your time to talk with me today about this. And I wish you and Asimov's and Analog the best of luck with maintaining human first.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for engaging in this great conversation.
Sure thing.